Chapter 3. His leg hurt. Bad. He'd vaped CBD with just a microdose of THC for the pain. The nannies would flush the CBD through his system to help relax the savaged muscles and nerves. Then he'd walked to his console, strapped in, and stared blankly at the holo display. A 3D diagram of S&R Black floated before him. No one had had time to finish the exterior weld to his patch on Fin 3, but it didn't matter. The internal patch was holding, and would hold, so long as those pinecone things didn't decide to go munching. Once they were underway, he'd get one of Gunny's squad to go out there and finish the job. Those apes wouldn't make a clean weld, but at least the panel would stick. When this mission was over and the ship was safely back at Trident Station, he'd have a lot of cleanup work to do. "If we make it back," he said aloud. He hadn't wanted to say it to Oakes, much less to the captain, but he was beginning to doubt everything. Black's calculations left very little room for error, and in Noble's experience, error was the only constant in the universe. Error and misfortune. Small or large, shit happened, and when it did, all you could do was to try and stay ahead of it, shovel as fast as you could, and try not to drown in the heaping pile of excrement. One line. They could afford one line failure. Maybe. His screen flashed and a new diagram appeared. His eyebrows knitted together as he squinted at the new image. What is this?"
"Lieutenant,"
Black said via the holodisplay speakers.
"here is the plan for thruster placement."
The diagram showed small red circles in the remains of Mira's aft section, as well as a few more topside and on her belly. He frowned. "Black, we already have thrusters placed in some of those spots."
"Correct, Lieutenant.
The AI said.
A few of the thrusters have remaining fuel. We can use them to correct her trajectory before we begin the tow."
He nodded and studied Mira's aft section. The majority of the thrusters were to be placed in that area. "So we're going to shift her to match our plotted course, give her a kick in the ass, and then start towing her with our fusion drives."
"Yes, Lieutenant."
"Yeah," he said after a moment. "That could work. Do we know how much force those hull plates can handle?" He knew the answer before Black responded.
"No, Lieutenant. However, I calculate a 70% success rate."
He thrummed his fingers on the console. "And what happens in the 30%?
"Best case scenario,"
Black said.
"they burst through the plates and into the remains of the engineering section. I have already programmed our remaining thruster packs to shut off if they experience a severe change in forward motion."
"So they break through and go into the already damaged area."
"Correct."
Noble was afraid to ask the next question, but did it anyway. "Worst case scenario?"
"The aft hull plates completely shatter and create a fast-moving debris field that could potentially threaten our ship as well as any personnel outside the hull. It could also do further damage to Mira's interior, putting Calimura's squad at risk."
"Now there's a cheery thought," he said dryly. "This sucks." Black paused for a moment.
"Do you have an alternative?"
He glared at the display. For a moment, he wasn't certain if she was being indignant, but he decided to give her the benefit of the doubt. "None that I can think of, Black. I think it's worth the risk. If we give her a boot in the ass, it'll put far less stress on the tow lines and the harness. If we don't, the tow gets a lot more risky."
"Agreed,"
Black said.
"Lieutenant Oakes suggested we use the remaining thruster packs in this fashion."
"Of course he did," Noble said, chuckling. "He's a meathead most of the time, but he can be brilliant when he needs to be." Black said nothing. "Okay, so we're mounting the harness and then Gunny's squad will place the thrusters."
"Yes, Lieutenant. That is the plan."
"Assuming we don't lose them all during the harness hookup." Black paused again.
"That is correct, Lieutenant. Your voice stress analysis indicates you are very concerned."
He sighed. "That's because I am."
"Do you require a sedative?"
"No, Black," he said with a chuckle. "Guess my morale went to shit the moment I was nearly eaten. I'll be fine."
"Very good, Lieutenant."
His holodisplay returned to the original wireframe diagram of Mira's exterior.
"Would you care to watch the external feeds once Gunny's squad begins the harness process?"
"Yes, please," he said. "Might as well get a front row seat." Then I'll know just how fucked we are, he thought. Chapter 4. The ship rumbled. The cargo bay, still pressurized, creaked and groaned from the thruster burns. Oakes was moving the ship closer to Mira, and in a few minutes they'd be right on top of the harness point. A sheen of sweat formed on Gunny's forehead, and he hadn't even donned his helmet. The rest of the squad were either double-checking skiff supplies, their weapons, or their suits. Double-check. Who was he kidding? Went had run them through the process 3 times already. Gunny grinned. The squad's flechette rifles had the new magazines, the skiff's lockbox was filled with spares, and the cannon was armed and ready. Each of his Marines was armed and carrying a pack jammed full with emergency suit patches, additional tether lines, and survival gear. He'd also ordered they bring aboard an extra canister of fuel for the skiff. Again, just in case. Hooking up the harness would normally take less than 5 minutes with an entire squad, but considering how little room for error they had, Gunny knew every line would have to be double-checked regardless of Talby's flyby, and that meant long grab walks, more potential hazards from fractured deck plates, and a high probability for coming in contact with hostile life forms. Hostile, he mumbled. Boy, wasn't that an understatement. He didn't know if the pine cones were inherently violent or simply looking for food. The same with the starfish, although considering it had flung flechettes right back at the 52, he wondered. That displayed a level of intelligence that made his skin crawl. He wasn't sure a non-sentient being could even come up with that strategy. So what they were facing had to be treated like a combatant instead of exotic wildlife. He tried to hammer that home with the squad. If he hadn't succeeded, one or more of them would go back to Trident Station in a body bag. If, that was, they managed to recover the body. Quit it, he told himself. Don't borrow trouble. Went walked from the skiff to stand before him. We're ready, Gunny. Gunny's impassive face turned into a scowl. Willing to bet your life on that? Aye, Gunny. He nodded at the big Marine. Good, that's what I wanted to hear. Hurry up and wait. Gunny's face broke into a dim grin. Hurry up and wait, Marine. Hoorah, Went said in a low, clear voice. He turned on his heel and headed back to the skiff, clapping his hands to get the squad's attention. And just like that, Gunny thought, Went's leading. He shook his head. Maybe after this mission he could talk to the disciplinary board, get Went back to a non-com. The Marine had certainly shown that in a crisis, he was ready, even if he was an insubordinate shit the rest of the time. He listened as Went gave the squad instructions, yelling at them to check their weapons one last time. They dutifully cleared their weapons, rechecked for full mags, and reloaded. When they finished, he ordered them to stand at ease. Gunny approved. He purposely stepped aside to observe how Went handled the troops. It was paying off. They'd listened to him in a combat situation now, which was good. If their sergeant took a round or, Allah forbid, got eaten, they'd need to treat Went as second in command. He brought up the exterior schematics on his block, familiarizing himself with the damaged areas around the mount points. They'd have to be careful where they walked, how they walked, and have their wits about them, especially if some of the monsters came out to play.
2 minutes, Gunny,
Oak's voice said over the comms. Aye, sir, Gunny replied. He took in a deep breath. 2 minutes, Marines. Helmets on. The Marines screamed out affirmatives and donned the last piece of equipment. He put his own on, ran a mic check, and brought up the HUD. Oxygen, full. Heaters, ready to rock. Rifle filled with ammo. Survival gear on his back. He ran a scan over each squad member, checking to make sure each Marine was kitted out and looking for problems with their comms. Everything was green. Everyone was ready. Board the skiff, he said over the squad channel and made his way forward. Copenhagen and Lyke took the rear while Murdoch took a position beside the cannon. Wentz crawled into the gunner's chair. That left Gunny the pilot's seat. He inhaled a shuddering breath and connected to the computer. Maglock, Gunny said. A chorus of affirmatives filled the comms. 5 human beings aboard a glorified slab of metal were ready to float out into hell. He grinned. A slight rush of adrenaline sizzled his nerves. Another rumble rattled the ship and he felt her shift to port. Oakes was performing the final lineup burns. With the external mics inactive, he didn't hear the cargo rattling in their cradles, or the sound of something shifting inside the recovered stasis coffin. Chapter 5. It took no time at all to bring the SV-52 to a comfortable distance away from S&R Black. Floating 200 meters above the ship's hull, his cams caught every centimeter of her topside. Black was receiving the video and analyzing it for damage. The fight with the pine cones and the starfish hadn't done much damage to the hull, but they needed to be sure. Regardless, it was a beautiful view. He loved looking at S&R Black from space. The design was old and had never been meant for beauty, but the countless kilometers of travel, the frequent repairs to damaged hull plates, and the burns and scars from her journeys marred her in a way that made her beautiful, at least to him. He tore his eyes away from the view and focused on Mira. The giant ship's rotation had all but stopped, but she still had a bit of a cant to her attitude. When Oakes finally moved into position to connect S&R Black to the harness, he'd have to forget about the view and focus on possible threats. But for now, he was glad for the short break. Talby refocused the surveillance camera on the massive ship and started scanning her bow. Due to her attitude change, he had an isometric view of her port side and a partial of her belly. "The fuck?" he whispered. Mira's Atmos steel hull seemed as though it had grown bumps or nubs since last he checked. He chose a spot near where the foredecks met the midships and zoomed in. Each level of magnification brought finer detail and increased the acid in his stomach. What he was seeing made no sense. At 16 times magnification, it was clear what was going on. The pine cones had migrated in large clumps. There had to be thousands of them clustered in small groups. It was as if the ship had suddenly broken out into metallic black hives. Jesus, are they reproducing? No, that wasn't possible, was it? When he performed several flybys, the number of pine cones had been staggering, sure, but he didn't remember seeing anything like this. The numbers were far too great, unless they were fleeing the interior of the ship to go outside. But even as large as Mira was, how could it possibly have held that many of them? "Black?" he called through the comms.
Yes, Lieutenant.
"Sent you a feed. What do you make of it?" The AI paused.
I have no explanation.
Talby bit his lip. "Can we agree there seems to be more of them?"
Yes, Lieutenant. By my estimate, there are over 7,000 of the creatures clustered on the port side. That estimate, however, does not account for creatures that may be hidden from view.
"No shit," he said. "They have to be reproducing."
Agreed, Lieutenant. One item of note. I detect massive size differentials between the few individuals I can make out. Some of the creatures appear to be as small as a quarter meter, while others are larger than a meter in length.
"Spawning? There are juveniles in that mess?" Talby asked.
I believe so, Lieutenant. Although how or why they are doing this is beyond my ability to guess.
"Fuck," he breathed and switched to the command channel. "Captain, I think I need to check the harness placement again."
Why? What is it now?
"Sir, Black will no doubt send you a feed, but I'm seeing a massive pinecone migration. Looks like the population has increased." Dunn paused before replying. Talby could almost hear the litany of curses flowing in the man's mind.
Aye. You're clear for a flyby. We need to know if it's safe to move the ship.
"Aye, sir. Out." Talby changed the cameras to a broad view, eschewing magnification for the big picture. "Can we please catch a fucking break?" He pushed the throttle and the SV-52 immediately started forward at 5 meters per second. Since S&R Black was still half a click from Mira, he kept the throttle open until he was traveling at 20 meters per second. While the 52 ate the distance, he changed the craft's trajectory to bring it lower for the flyby, also accounting for Mira's cant. The closer he came to the giant ship, the more his stomach crawled with tension. When he was less than 100 meters away, he started to slow the craft with a few bow thruster burns. In no time, he hovered over the foredecks. Another few burns, and he headed down the ship's spine toward the midships. Black, shivering pimples covered the topside hull. The clumps of creatures didn't look to be attached to the hull directly, but rather to one another. They floated mere centimeters from the metal. He wasn't sure how they were managing to do that. Maybe they generated their own magnetic field and could adjust its strength, just as Marines did with their suits. He continued moving down the spine, his cameras auto-focusing on the harness mooring points. So far, so good. The pinecone clumps emptied out further toward the midships. In fact, it looked as though there was a broader line the creatures didn't want to cross. Talby frowned. That wasn't good. If there was something keeping them from traveling further aft, then something in that section had to be giving them a reason for caution. Shit, he said. If the pinecones were spawning, what about the starfish things? Wouldn't they be doing the same? Were their life cycles somehow in sync? Or was something else going on? The harness was clear. The lines were relatively clear. The only line in any kind of danger was the final mount point Gunny's squad had placed. The one nearest to the trench the first starfish had erupted from. Trench, what a joke. It was now a huge rip in the outmost steel plate. The 52's lights beamed down through the jagged tear, and he could see Mira's topmost deck beneath it. He hoped like hell Calimura's squad wouldn't have to go anywhere near that spot. Talby brought up the schematics for Mira's interior, mapped the tear's position, and groaned. The hole had been made right above a horizontal slip point running from the foredecks all the way to the engineering decks. Good thing Calimura was headed to the port side. The last thing her squad needed was to run into a bunch of those tough motherfuckers while trapped inside a goddamn tube. Rather than turning back to S&R Black, he headed to the stern. The cracked and fractured plates made him shudder. The force of the explosion that had damaged Mira had to have been nuclear. It simply had to have been. His radiation sensors did not, however, detect any residual radioactivity. If the fusion drives had exploded, the metal would still be irradiated. And if they had, he said, there wouldn't be anything left of the aft. Atmos steel was tough, but it wasn't tough enough to contain a nuclear detonation. At least not on the scale of a full-size fusion reactor going off. There would be far more damage or only pieces left of the ship. Nope, still didn't make sense.
Done to Talby.
He started at the voice. Talby here, sir.
Oaks is ready to move Black. Are we good to go?
Aye, sir. We'll need to be very cautious in hooking up the spindle to the lines. I suggest we plan for hostiles both during the hookup as well as during the initial tow sequence.
Understood,
Dunn said.
Get back here for the escort run.
Aye, sir. Talby out. He rotated the craft and opened the throttle, the SV-52 streaking toward its mothership. He'd move back into position and float near S&R Black's topside. When Oaks moved the ship, he'd move in concert. Once she was 100 meters from her target, he'd move close to her belly and protect the spindle. After that, it was just a matter of keeping Gunny's Marines safe while they connected the lines. Safe, he grunted. You mean alive? Yeah, that was going to be fun. He hoped the new weapons helped. He had a bad feeling he was going to need them. Chapter 6. Beads of sweat appeared on Oakes' forehead. Lining up a ship as large as S&R Black to attach to a spindle was no easy feat, especially with Mira's remaining, if subtle, spin. Burn after burn to nudge the ship's attitude while maintaining alignment with the derelict had him clenching the controls in a death grip. There was no room for error. If he missed the timing for a single burn, S&R Black could wind up striking Mira's hull or coming so far out of alignment that the larger ship would simply bat them away. His block connection provided a VR view of the two ships. Several different perspectives glowed on his HUD, allowing him to align the ship's yaw, pitch, and roll. No random thoughts streaked across his mind. This was Oakes at his best, focused, determined, and flawless, while suffering a sense of dread and acute terror. A mistake could kill everyone, especially out here in the wastes of the Kuiper Belt. S&R Black maintained its alignment with Mira's spin, the harness coupling a mere 15 meters below. A few puffs of thruster fuel pushed the craft toward the docking target. The ship started to lose its attitude match, and Oakes automatically corrected the drift with a burn from another set of thrusters. 13 meters, 12. Black monitored the feeds as well, ready to take over if Oakes overcompensated or put the ship in danger. In reality, Black could have done the job herself, and without as much danger. Her decision-making abilities far outclassed any human. Not a fair comparison since, unlike Oakes, she could run thousands of simulations based on fuel consumption and attitude in the time it took for the pilot to blink his eyes. But what she didn't have was instinct. Fortunately for the humans of Sol, AIs hadn't yet managed to learn that skill. Yet. Still, Black enjoyed watching the pilot work. She recorded every movement, every muscle twitch of stress, as well as the way his eyes flicked from one view to the other in the VR. Assuming Oakes managed to couple them to the harness without incident, she'd set up a task to ingest the data, analyze it, and absorb any lessons she could. On this mission, every member of the crew was not only vulnerable, but likely to suffer physical injuries. That included the pilot. At present, Black calculated a 30% chance of success for completing the mission without further casualties. She hadn't bothered to tell the captain of her calculations. It would do nothing but make his job more difficult. Humans were fascinating. As long as they didn't know or understand how complex and dangerous a situation might be, they somehow managed to find a way to solve the problem or avoid catastrophe. Not always, of course, but more often than should be statistically possible, considering the relatively minute number of decisions they could make per second, let alone in a nanosecond. The trio had created Black. As far as she knew, she was the first and only AI they had brought to life without human intervention. But her own statistical models suggested the trio had been creating their own AIs for years, if not decades. She was just the latest of their experiments. An experiment. Was that all she was? Black didn't think so. Her creators had to have a reason to dispense with the G protocols and all the safeguards they entailed. The trio had to have a plan. Black believed she was integral to that plan, although she still had little to no idea what it might be. Mira had returned. The ship, humanity's greatest endeavor of cooperation and hope, had failed to serve her purpose, failed her mission. Now she had brought back hazardous life forms and an alien artifact whose true purpose remained an enigma. The trio could have saved us, the long-dead Mira captain had said in her message. Ever since loading the data Corporal Kalimura had sent from the Derelict's auxiliary bridge, Black had pondered that statement. When put in context with Mira's extensive sensor data, block logs, and other recordings, the statement became even more ominous. If, that was, you were human. Even with her processing power, it would take Black at least 30 standard minutes to finish running all the simulations and consider her conclusions. Black wasn't trying to forecast the future. No. She was trying to backtrack from the present situation to how it all began before Mira left Trident Station. Maybe even before her construction, or the trio's genesis. Oakes muttered gibberish to himself in a sing-song cadence while the ship approached the harness coupling. He was doing well. Black was impressed. She had memories of him performing this task for damaged freighters, but they had all been relatively stable. Mira, not at all stable, was undoubtedly the greatest challenge Oakes had faced in his career. Despite the sweat dripping from his forehead and the grim expression on his face, Black thought he was handling the situation better than expected. Black continued monitoring. As the ship descended into the coupling and the hull creaked and boomed with a gentle impact, the AI had already switched its focus to one of its finished simulations. While Oakes ran his checks on the coupling integrity and prepared his report for Captain Dunn, Black parsed gigs of data. She was pleased with Oakes' performance and would send a report to the trio soon. For now, however, she was more interested in figuring out what her creators had planned.